You watch the glass doors slide shut and you know, for a second, that nothing ordinary is about to happen. If this story pulls at you, like, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening from. Evelyn had laughed without thinking. It was the sort of laugh that lived in her ribs, quick, a little sharp at the edges, the kind Lauren said made people trust her before they had a reason to. They'd been clustered by the kitchenette on the 23rd floor. White marble, a single hanging fern that refused to die, a skyline of glass and river that turned late afternoon into a strip of molten metal. A junior account manager had been telling a ridiculous rumor about Maxwell Ashford, the CEO who kept the building's elevators whisper quiet and calendars impenetrable. He has a secret garden, the junior said, eyes too wide, like a child with contraband. Somewhere on the roof, he grows orchids and, get this, poetry. The room had hummed. Lauren rolled her eyes dramatically. A tech lead snorted into his coffee. Evelyn, with a coffee stain still on her sleeve from the morning, had let loose a laugh that echoed, too bright, too loud. And then she had said, in the kind of tone that made the joke land like a pebble in a quiet pond, "Maxwell? Poet? Please. He probably orders plants online and forgets to water them." She hadn't meant for the sound to travel beyond their little cluster, but halls on the 23rd floor were long and glass-lined, channels for gossip as much as for sunlight. The laughter snagged on a different air, and she felt it before she saw who it belonged to. A measured breath, a quiet annoyance softened by something else, an amused curiosity that made the air around it shimmer. He was standing in the doorway, coat unbuttoned despite the glass and marble cool, one hand in the pocket of trousers that had been tailored the way a man who loves order buys clothes, precisely without fuss. Sunlight flattened his jaw into planes Evelyn had catalogued in passing. She had seen him in investor videos, had watched him from a distance at the town hall when her team had been eager for any hint of recognition. But seeing Maxwell Ashford at 3 feet, in the same hallway where she'd been the loudest voice in the room, was different. There was a small, almost private smile that refused to be a smile, and eyes that measured like a thermostat. He had always been described as distant in the emails that circulated when big decisions were made. Up close, he was controlled in the way a conductor is controlled, every movement deliberate, every syllable counted. Her mouth had gone dry. She had looked to Lauren as if to be rescued, but Lauren's face had been exact and terrifyingly blank, the look of someone who knew better than to interrupt a scene that might be important. Maxwell's voice when he spoke had been softer than she had expected, as if he were asking whether a fragile thing might be left alone or pried. "You're laughing about my orchids," he said. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: Ed, you're laughing about my orchids, he said. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Não, Maxwell said, I'm not. O corredor sentiu-se contrair. Quieto se ganhou como pó. O junior account manager havia ejado back toward the snacks, suddenly uninterested in overhearing the CEO's private admissions. Lauren's elbow had pressed into Evelyn's ribs with the precision of a warning. Evelyn's hands, warm from the coffee cup she'd been holding, had begun to sweat. I like quiet things, Maxwell continued, as if explaining a preference for chamomile over espresso. I like to write now and then. I like order. I also notice people. It was that last phrase that unlocked something and made the world shift. He noticed people. Not the brand, not the elevator logistics, not the quarterly slides. People. Evelyn had a reflex to check for hidden cameras. Corporate PR loved the theatrical. There were none. Only Maxwell, who had stepped out into a public hallway on an ordinary Tuesday and was telling her, plainly, that he paid attention. That was an unnecessary laugh, he said, but useful. It tells me you mean what you say to your team. Useful? Her laugh this time was smaller, and it had the edge of someone who'd been suddenly told the rules to a game she hadn't been invited to play. Yes. He closed the door behind him with a motion that felt almost like a sigh. The office returned to its background hum. Systems beeped soft notifications. Outside the glass, the city moved like a machine that had no interest in private equations. Maxwell held out his hand. "May I have a word?" His voice asked for permission rather than assuming it. Evelyn could have declined, could have let the moment pass into rumor and silence. Instead, something in the cadence of his speech, the carefulness, made her step forward. She wanted to know the shape of the man she had made a punchline of, and if there was a poet in the room, then she wanted to see how he wrote. Curiosity had a way of undoing self-preservation. They walked 20 paces and stopped by the bank of elevators. It was one of those moments that later felt too cinematic to be true. Light streaming across his cheek, the hum of the building like a soundtrack. Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: Rick, the hum of the building like a soundtrack. Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Riyadh, do you ever wonder what it's like to be read? Only when I'm afraid someone will misread me, she said. He looked at her then with something like gratitude and something else, an admission prepared like a safety plan. What I am about to say matters, Evelyn. I am the CEO. But here, now, I'm asking you to hear something besides the title. I have been aware of you, your work, your laugh, the way you correct junior copy in margins no one will ever see. I find I want to know you. Her breath found a new rhythm. You're interested? Yes. He did not offer the word casually. He let it land. The honesty in his tone removed any smugness from his position. If the hallway had been a stage before, it felt suddenly private and small. I understand the imbalance. I understand the consequences. I am not asking you to act because I'm the CEO. I am asking you because I want you to choose me, knowing what that might mean for you. Consent lodged in her spine like a rule she had to follow. She could say no. She could tell him his voice was dangerous because of the position it came from. She could imagine all the HR forms and the whispered judgments that would follow. But she also felt, with the clarity of an alarm, that to say nothing would be to never find out if there was a story that belonged to both of them. I don't sleep on decisions that involve my job, she said, though she felt the words were not entirely true. She slept on most decisions and found them widened in the morning. This could, she faltered, it could hurt my career. It could hurt you. It could, he conceded, which is why, if you are willing to see whether there's something here, I will accept the consequences. I will be transparent when the time is right. I will not, he paused, and his mouth thinned in a way that made her think of meetings and margins. I will not, he paused, and his mouth thinned in a way that made her think of meetings and margins. I will not use my position to press you. There are steps we can take. We can speak to HR confidentially about the best path forward. I can delegate oversight of your team to Jason until things are clear. I can do whatever it takes to make sure you are not compromised. The flatness of the marble seemed less heavy now. The promise of safeguards sounded like a kind of pledge. It should have felt like prelude, legalese dressed as romance. Instead, when her hands found the hem of her sleeve and twisted, it felt like someone had opened a secret drawer, showing her an unexpected thing inside. "Why me?" she asked. She had to know. It was practical to know motives. Curiosity had a neatness to it. He smiled then, the kind of small, private smile that belonged on a man who had practiced restraint. Because you laugh when you're honest? Because you send your corrections late at night and then apologize for doing so? Because you told Lauren once, privately, that you couldn't stand when people wasted time being performatively kind and then left the work undone? Because when you got on the wrong floor elevator 2 weeks ago and read a book out of habit until you found the right one, you were content alone in the way that looked like you were never waiting for approval. She wanted to protest that he was far too observant. Instead, his words settled like pages turned by a steady hand, bringing to life small scenes she didn't expect anyone to have seen. "Do you want me to be honest then?" she asked, and the weight of the question was not lost on her. To be honest could mean to expose herself to scrutiny or to open a gift she would later regret. "Because I laughed, because I was nervous. I laughed to make space so I don't have to cry in front of people who are important to me." He nodded. "I prefer laughs to tears, but I prefer truth most of all." There was a pause, a space where decision lived. Evelyn thought of Lauren waiting by the kitchenette, of the list of deadlines on her phone, of the life she had constructed with small, steady choices that rarely rippled the water. She thought of how often she had been overlooked because excellence was not loud. She thought of a possible cost. "Okay," she said, finally, "but on one condition." "Name it." "We make a plan. We talk to HR about disclosure. You delegate oversight of my direct assignments to someone neutral. We agree on boundaries at work. No public displays, no private meetings that could look like favoritism. We will not make my position more precarious to serve either of our comforts." Her words were clipped with the kind of conviction that is practiced by people who care about reputations because they've built them from scratch. "I will do that," Maxwell said, "and more. I will accept any professional consequences that come if we get this wrong. I will be prepared to be transparent to the board if that's what it takes." She had expected theatrical apologies. She had not expected this. A man of power, naming the risks, spelling out steps, offering himself to accountability like an instrument he trusted. It didn't erase the imbalance, but it showed an awareness of it and a willingness to bear part of the burden. "And emotionally?" she asked. "Absolutely consensual, Evelyn. If at any point you want out, you say, no guilt, no pressure. I will respect you." It was not a clean guarantee. There were always messy edges in human relationships, but it was more than she had expected from a CEO of 20 years who had been rumored to move through the company like a silent storm. They stepped back into the stream of colleagues and fluorescent light. Lauren gave Evelyn a look that meant she'd been briefed on the gravity of the choice and found it both scandalous and thrilling. The junior account manager whispered something about the CEO's secret and then snuck a peek over his shoulder as if the spectacle were a soap opera. The first kiss happened later that week in a place both public and private, the stairwell between the 23rd and 22nd floors, a neutral gray stairwell with industrial lighting and the muffled city as a base layer. It was not an embrace that could be read as policy compliant or compliant with rumors. It was a stolen exhale, a contact charged with the kind of electricity that comes when two people lay down rules and then find they want to test them anyway. Maxwell had been the one to initiate this one, leaning in like a man measuring the distance between sunlight and shadow. He paused, entirely attentive to her face, and asked, "Are you sure?" There was the consent, articulated and clear, and she answered, yes. He kissed her then with a gentleness that was careful to stay within the bounds they'd decided. No pressure, a slow discovery rather than a possession. Hands rested at shoulders, nothing invasive. The concrete under their shoes vibrated with a distant elevator. It was a moment that made the world tilt, the kind of tilt that reoriented priorities. And then it was over, a secret tucked into the seams of the building. They made arrangements as adults. Maxwell arranged for Jason, the operations chief, to oversee the account Evelyn contributed to. Jason's name was on every request form and chain of responsibility. Maxwell scheduled a private meeting with HR to lay out an ethical plan, not a confession, but a framework for transparency in case the relationship became public. Evelyn insisted on a communication protocol. No emails about personal matters on company servers, no meetings involving both of them and their direct reports alone. Maxwell agreed, and in each small concession, he demonstrated that his power could be reshaped, not wielded, and that he was willing to be the one to change. They were discreet initially, not secret because secrecy felt dishonest. Instead, they were deliberate. Evelyn and Maxwell met at times that did not invite speculation. Lunch at the small bistro 2 blocks away. A Thursday night at a gallery that hosted corporate mixers where familiar faces blurred into the crowd. The city became measured in the hours they chose. Maxwell let others take the lead on decisions that might expose her to favor. Evelyn remained professional, her work steady and uncompromised. There were awkward moments. An HR representative had cornered Lauren in the kitchenette, gently probing whether Evelyn had seemed distracted at work. But the couple managed the aftermath with transparency, and Maxwell accepted the small professional costs without pretense. And yet the world noticed. Rumors moved faster than policies. A photo surfaced, someone's pocketed phone at a gallery, a dark blur of Maxwell's profile and Evelyn's laugh, and a thread began that would not easily be stopped. The board called a closed-door briefing. Investors asked for written assurances that no conflict of interest existed. Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era assurances that no conflict of interest existed. Você está no meio de uma frase pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Evelyn fielded every question with the same steady hand he had shown Evelyn in the stairwell. Directness, a willingness to be accountable, a refusal to sugarcoat. He spoke plainly about the safeguards they'd put in place, about how Jason now oversaw any decisions that might impact Evelyn's team, about his willingness to step back from certain portfolios while the relationship sorted itself out. He presented facts, he accepted scrutiny. Evelyn lived through the scrutiny like a new kind of weather. There were private mornings when she sat in her kitchen and considered drafting resignation letters, imagining a life outside the architecture of marble and glass. Lauren held her hands and said what friends say when everything is heavy, that she had earned the ability to choose, that the company would survive, that she needed to trust Maxwell's words. The thing about love, Evelyn learned, was that it kept asking for the same small acts of faith. Choose again, speak again, stand in the open with the tent flaps undone. Then Miami came like a test. Maxwell had been scheduled to host a client dinner during the conference week. Evelyn's team had been asked to put together a creative brief for a new brand push, and it was useful to have the junior art director on site for rapid approvals. Jason, who had been assigned oversight to avoid impropriety, nominated Evelyn as the on-site liaison. The paperwork looked clean. Everyone had signatures in the right places. Evelyn flew down with the sense of doing her job, measuring her answers, staying professional. Miami, in other hands, might have been an opportunity for suspicion. It was humid, luminous, and full of white linen shirts that made the city look like a postcard. Evelyn felt a nervous buzz in the heat, a carnival of possibilities that made her cheeks flush. Maxwell, when he arrived, was less suit and tie and more casual navy shirt, and it made him look softer, like a man shedding armor before a private watch. They kept the week public and transactional during the day. Client meetings, feedback sessions, presentations where both of them presented as colleagues, and private at night, within the rules they'd set. No secret hotel rendezvous, no blurred lines in the company of others. They ate in public, sat apart sometimes in meetings, and preserved the facade of professional equilibrium. But late one night, the ocean drew them. The client dinner had ended in applause and polite applause. The city hummed beyond the windows. Maxwell suggested a walk to clear the head, and Evelyn agreed, thinking of salt and dark and the honest sound of waves. The moon smudged over the water like a borrowed coin. They walked barefoot in the sand because someone had suggested it, and neither of them refused the small absurdity. Their toes sank, the Atlantic breathing in a steady rhythm beneath them. They found a quiet patch of beach and sat, shoulders nearly touching. For several minutes they simply listened to the sea, and that listening felt like a conversation that didn't require translation. Maxwell's hand found Evelyn's, curled with the easy authority of someone used to shaping outcomes. She allowed the hand to rest, measuring consent every second. There was something about the honesty of the ocean that loosened caution. The waves didn't pretend discretion, and yet they were constant. "Do you ever regret it?" Maxwell asked, voice low, as if afraid to disturb the tide. "Regret what?" Evelyn kept her voice small. "This. Coming out, risking the company, bringing you into any of this." He turned his hand so the moonlight caught the line of his knuckles like a map. "Sometimes I wonder whether I should have chosen differently, if discretion or resignation would have been kinder." "To whom?" she asked. "To you," he said, "to how I made you right now." Evelyn turned to look at him properly, not the impersonal short lines of the company's portrait, but the man whose laugh in the hallway had been the beginning of everything. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen in the office. He looked human. "You didn't make me," she said. "You found me. And you offered, what was it? A plan and a vow to be accountable. Those are choices you can control." He exhaled. "I am used to control," he said. "It's been the engine of my life. But you," he searched for the word, "you make me want to be less controlled in a good way, more present. I value that more than I thought I would." The moonlight was generous. Evelyn let herself be held by the honesty of the sentence. For a moment, the world of work, calendars and bylaws and whispered office gossip shrank to the size of their hands. Maxwell leaned forward and kissed her. Not the quick, formal kiss of the stairwell, but a softer, deeper thing that carried with it the weight of days under scrutiny and the promise of more. It was consensual in the slow way consent becomes obvious. A hand lifted, a breath matched, a voice that never fell into pleading. When they broke apart, the ocean had rearranged itself. The horizon glowed with the warmth of a city that felt less like a workplace and more like the backdrop of a small, important rebellion. Miami tightened the knot of their relationship and yet also widened the possibilities for fallout. A picture was taken, someone's phone angled from an adjacent chaise longue. And within hours, a blurred photo fluttered online. The comments were a mixture of gossip and curiosity. Some people saw romance, some privilege, others saw the pattern of a company's power dynamics being enacted in glossy frames. The board convened again. Investors wanted assurance. The company's PR drafted a statement assuring stakeholders that all measures were taken to avoid conflicts of interest, that oversight had been delegated, that the company's performance would not hinge on personal relationships. Evelyn learned to navigate the storm in small increments. Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "Armed to navigate the storm in small increments". Você está no meio de uma frase pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Fim das instruções. She answered emails with the same precision as before, presenting metrics and creative edits, refusing to let the picture be the summation of her work. Maxwell did what he said he would. He recused himself from decisions directly involving her team, sent weekly updates to the board describing the delegation, and agreed to a third-party audit of any decisions that might resemble favoritism. He also accepted, privately, the sting of apology from board members who were less angry than disappointed, a different shape of reproach. The couple's secret, if it could still be called secret, had become a public fact with private consequences. They argued sharply and sometimes without grace. Evelyn's anger surfaced in accusations about his failure to foresee pain, Maxwell's in a stubborn defense of his competence, and a fear that admitting fault might undo the very structure he had built. They nearly unraveled in disagreements that had nothing to do with romance, logistics, power, who paid for what in ways that felt both absurd and meaningful. But in each fight, they returned, battered but deliberate, to the core promise, honesty and accountability. One night in Miami, after a loud argument about a missed call and a misread text, Evelyn had packed a small bag with more impulse than planning and told Maxwell she needed air. She walked the strip alone and ended up at a small pier watching night fishermen cast lines into the luminous water. Maxwell found her, as he had a way of doing, standing 2 meters away with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man waiting for instruction. "Evelyn," he said, and his voice softened in a way that made her heart betray the anger. "I've been thinking about what you said, about public displays and private consequences. If we are going to be in this, then I will accept any consequences, financial, professional, reputational. I will do the things I promised. But I also want to grow with you. I want to change how I lead, so it's not just about control." She had turned to him then, the pier's wood creaking under their shoes, the city behind them a smear of neon. "Words are cheap," she said. He smiled a little, as if adoration came with an invoice. "Then measure me by action," he said. "Tell me how to do better, Evelyn. Tell me what would make you feel safer here. If you want me to resign, say it. If you want me to shift my portfolio, say it. I will not ask you to bear the cost alone." The ocean was a patient witness. Evelyn found herself answering not out of the rawness of the argument, but from the core of who she was, someone who believed in earned trust. "Keep the delegation," she said. "Sign the recusal in writing. Make our private lives private on company channels. If anything needs to be announced, be the one to do it with clarity. And—" she paused, because none of this could cover all the dizziness in her chest. "If you ever use your position to coerce me, if you ever try to make the choice for me because it suits you, I will leave." He reached for her then and did not try to speak her out of her line. He took the conditions as truth and signed them with the gravity of someone who understood that promises are measured by their keeping. They didn't walk out of Miami unscathed, but they left with a new pact, not of secrecy, but of structure. They agreed to prepare a joint statement in the event they disclosed publicly. They agreed to sit with HR to formalize a plan. They agreed to keep the boundaries they had set, even when it was inconvenient. The rules were not romantic, but they were adult, and in the trust of adult agreements, something intimate flourished. Back in Manhattan, the office seemed the same in most ways. Light cutting across glass, the hum of servers, the discreet clatter of heels. But for Evelyn, everything had shifted. Where she had once been anonymous, she was now the woman who had laughed in the hallway and then taken a risk. Colleagues treated her with the same professional cadence, but with an extra softness at the edges, a look that combined curiosity with the respect of someone who had watched a private life unfold into the light. Lauren teased her mercilessly, but with the devotion of a friend who had been consulted and then updated. Maxwell's eyes found her in meetings, not to command her, but to check in, those small invisible signals that told her he still remembered the boundaries they'd drawn. Then came the moment the title of their story hinted at, a reveal that changed the terms of how people looked at them. It wasn't a scandalous lie exposed or a hidden family secret. It was something quieter, but still shocking in its way. Maxwell's admission, public and deliberate, at the quarterly all-hands meeting. An admission about his fears, his mistakes, and the way this relationship had forced him to confront the parts of leadership that had been sterile in his life. The lights in the auditorium dimmed to a hush. Maxwell stood at the podium with measured decisiveness. He could have read prepared statements about performance and vision. Instead, he looked out at the rows of faces and began differently. "There are things leadership doesn't teach you," he said. "Control is one of them. Being responsible for people is also responsibility for how your personal life might affect those people. I have made choices that could be perceived as careless. I want to be transparent about them." Evelyn sat in the front row, fingers interlaced, feeling like an object lesson and a participant in equal measure. He spoke about delegation, about the mechanisms he'd put in place, and then, most unexpectedly, he invited her to the stage. Her heart hammered. For a beat, she wondered whether her presence would be perceived as spectacle. Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "And her presence would be perceived as spectacle." Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. She rose because she had promised herself to be brave in this new life, and she walked to the stage, glass walls of the auditorium making the room feel like a fishbowl. Lauren mouthed, "You good?" from the third row with comedic solemnity. Evelyn waved slightly. Maxwell gestured to the microphone as if offering a shield. "Evelyn," he said, "would you like to say something?" The revelation, if revelation it could be called, was not that they were together. The company already suspected. The shock came from how they chose to narrate it, not as a confession of sin or a defensive measure, but as a moment of shared accountability. Evelyn took the mic and felt the weight of 1,000 little judgments press at the edges of her ribs. She could have retreated behind the corporate statement they drafted together. She could have read legalese. Instead, she spoke like someone who had been seen in the hallway and had then chosen to step into the light. "I laughed," she began, and the first laugh came back to her as a memory that no longer stung. "I laughed when someone said the CEO had a secret. I did not think the man who could shape my career would notice the thinness of my favorite scarf or the way I corrected copy at night. But he did. We have made choices together about how this will work and how we will bear the consequences. We have asked the company and our board to hold us accountable, and they have. We are not asking for special treatment. With Maxwell's delegation and the oversight we've set up, I continue to do the work I was hired to do. That will not change." The auditorium murmured, some with approval, others with the caution of people who measure risk. Maxwell picked up from her and finished with the kind of clarity that had become his new signature. "I should have known to anticipate the consequences," he said. "I did not, and for that I apologize. But I will also say this. I am committed to being measured by my actions, not my title. Evelyn is my equal as a partner in life and a professional. We invited oversight because we refuse to let our relationship become an excuse for opacity. That is the truth." The announcement rippled. It didn't erase the gossip, it reframed it. There were still meetings, but now there was, in boardrooms and around the water cooler, a sense that the couple had tried, clumsily and bravely, to do the right thing. If the story had been scandalous before, now it was a complicated lesson about power and love. Evelyn felt the eyes of the company differently after that day. Some colleagues smiled in solidarity. Others met her with a skepticism that was reasonable in the wake of such exposure. But the important thing, what had been true in the stairwell, on Miami's moonlit sand, and in countless small choices since, was that the relationship had matured into something that sought not to hide, but to be accountable. Their private life did not become easier. They navigated jealousy when Maxwell was called to late-night crises and Evelyn's work piled up. They had fights where Evelyn accused him of allowing the company to be more important than human connection. Maxwell accused her of not seeing the pressure he bore as the company's figurehead. But they returned to the pact they'd signed, sometimes breathless, sometimes trembling, always with the slow patience of people rebuilding trust. When Maxwell finally suggested a weekend away to Key West, it came with a seriousness that made Evelyn's chest hollow with both anticipation and caution. "I want to propose," he said plainly in a private conversation in his corner office, the skyline folding into night behind him. "But I also want to do it in a way that honors your agency. If you don't want to take this step, public, private, it's your choice. I will not rush you." Evelyn surprised herself by laughing then, not from embarrassment, but because the man had managed to pair the grandiosity of a proposal with the humility of a boardroom memo. "This is happening," she said. "You're being very earnest." "Because you deserve earnestness," he replied, "and because I have learned I need to put aside the automatic decisions." She felt the windows in her chest soften. To be proposed to by someone who had so recently been a headline and a source of whispers, and to know that he had gone through the trouble of agreeing to be accountable and public, felt like a closure and an opening at the same time. She wanted to choose him, not because the city would applaud, not because the titles lined up, but because in his moments of vulnerability, he had become someone she trusted with the fragile things. They planned a modest proposal, a small tableau on a Key West beach with lanterns and a handful of friends who were not connected to work. It was the exact type of romantic statement their lives needed, not ostentatious, not performative, just focused on them. Maxwell got down on one knee in the soft sand, the sea a gentle witness, the stars indifferent and somehow approving. Evelyn said yes because 1,000 small agreements had led to that moment. The stairwell kiss, the Miami Ocean, the formal recusal, the public admission at the all-hands. Saying yes was not an impulse, but a statement of choosing continuity in a relationship that had already asked them to be its mature stewards. The wedding followed months later, a warm ceremony in a garden in Santa Barbara where Maxwell's mother and Evelyn's parents watched them exchange vows. Maxwell's vow was the surprising release of a man who had learned to articulate his soft edges. "I built walls to keep things steady," he said. "You came and showed me that steadiness is not the same as safety. I vow to keep being accountable to you and to the people who entrust me with their work. I vow to choose you every day with the same deliberation I have tried to show in leadership, and to let myself be led sometimes by love rather than by control." Evelyn's vow was steadier in cadence and frank in its affection. "I vow to remind you when you forget to be present," she said with a laugh that made the gathered friends lean forward. "I vow to be honest when I'm hurt, to be patient when you're distracted, and to love you even on days when power and patience are both trying. I vow to hold our love in the air like a fragile thing we choose each morning." They kissed amid a sprinkling of rice and confetti, and the applause felt like a benediction not only of romance, but of two people who had navigated a landscape of power and come to a place where mutual responsibility mattered as much as feeling. The honeymoon followed with cities that tasted like postcards, Parisian cafes that made their hands less careful, Venetian canals that reminded them of the flow and counterflow of trust, Roman alleys that held echoes of vows whispered in two voices. In the months that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Maxwell delegated more, not because he had to, but because he discovered the freedom in letting teams lead. Evelyn found herself asserting boundaries in meetings with a clarity she hadn't known she possessed. They had arguments that were solvable because they knew how to return to the promises they'd signed in the margins of their early entanglement. They learned to accept that love in the shadow of titles would always be complicated, but also that complexity could be navigated with honesty and courage. On quiet mornings, they would sit by the window in their apartment that looked out on the river and watch the skyline tilt with weather. Maxwell would sometimes read aloud a poem he'd written. Nothing showy, just lines about light on marble or the sound of laughter in a hall. And Evelyn would laugh at him the way she had in the kitchen months before. But the laugh now landed differently. It was not a defense, but an acknowledgement of a beginning. She had laughed at the CEO's supposed secret and been corrected by life itself. He had revealed a truth that was surprising because it had no need to be theatrical. The man beneath the title wanted to be known, and he wanted to choose accountability as fiercely as he had once chosen control. Their story was messy, public, and stubbornly human. It had a beginning in a careless laugh and an ending not in closure, but in a continual practice of consent, communication, and the quiet work of love. The skyline beyond their window was still glass and marble and light. In it, they had found a space where transparency lived, not as a corporate policy, but as a daily choice. They learned to treat small ruptures as the weather, something that changed with the day rather than a prophecy etched in stone. Winter pressed against the windows one January and then relented. The river gleamed with the leftover cold the next afternoon. Maxwell took to walking before dawn when the city was still assembling itself, the streets his only audience. He would come back with coffee in his palms and the long list of things he no longer felt compelled to fix by himself. Evelyn would be at the sink, hair up, the light across her cheekbone, making ordinary dishes look like carved bone. They would exchange 2 sentences, one about a meeting, one about a poem. And that small scaffolding held more than either had expected. There were practical changes that mattered. Maxwell's calendar now included time blocked for reflection, an hour each week to meet with the people who could tell him hard things without flinching. He insisted those meetings be ad hoc at first, walk-in talks, coffee at the office kitchen, the sorts of encounters that resisted performance. Evelyn taught him to ask the quieter questions. What did I miss? Who feels unseen? He learned, haltingly, to receive the answers without turning them immediately into action plans. Sometimes a confession only needed to be heard. Evelyn's life moved in parallel grooves that occasionally converged with thunder. The promotion she deferred once to avoid the spectacle of their courtship found a new shape. Not an ascent into the same limelight, but a role that gave her jurisdiction over how the company represented itself to the public. She'd negotiated it with the same steadiness she had used on the stairwell the night she laughed. The kind of firmness that understood when to be flexible and when to be immovable. There, in the communication suite, she began to build practices informed by the things she had learned at home. A protocol for apologies that centered people, a cadence of reporting that valued truth over spin, a forum where former employees could offer critique without fear of retribution. They had days that were ordinary enough to be holy. On a Sunday in late spring, they walked a market where vegetables were still clustered like small planets. Maxwell stopped at a stall and bought a bunch of basil. Evelyn corrected him on the price, and he made a show of swearing to learn barter. At night, they would fall into each other on the couch and watch something unimportant. In those hours, the city dissolved to sound and breath. The rest of the world could wait. But the old world did not wait, and neither did ambition. A columnist, someone with a taste for tidy narratives, found an angle and wrote about the earlier scandal as if it were settled law rather than a tangled set of decisions and human failures. The column was rooted in truth but flattened the contours. It implied causality where nuance existed. It became a seed that the wind planted in the minds of certain investors, and a rival on the board began to fan those embers like a man stoking a hearth to watch the fire dance. The first sign of new trouble was small. A terse email sent late on a Tuesday, a request for an emergency meeting. Maxwell read it in the kitchen, the light over the island catching the rim of his coffee. He did not ask Evelyn to stay home. She came anyway, fingers stained with basil, because staying apart had an odor of avoidance. At the meeting that followed, a long, wood-paneled room where the faces around the table had not all changed, there was an insistence on procedure and a measure of suspicion that tasted metallic. The rival asked hard questions about governance, about who in the company had known what and when. Maxwell answered with the care of someone practicing new muscles. He spoke in lists, named the people who had been held accountable, described the structural changes they had enacted. But he also spoke in admissions, places he could have done better, moments where his instinct to protect the institution had overridden his instinct to be present. When he finished, there was a pause, not of acquittal, but of adjustment. He felt the old lure of control pull at him, the reflex to craft the perfect, unassailable defense. Instead, he let the pause be. Letting be, he had learned, did not equal weakness. Outside the boardroom, the media cycle would have its hunger. Evelyn prepared for that with a pragmatism that was almost tender. They practiced a few answers together in the living room, Maxwell fumbling sometimes with the words he had meant to make permanent. Evelyn corrected his cadence, and then, softer, his frame. "You can say no more than you know," she told him, "and you can say what you learned without making a confession into a performance." He nodded and watched her teach with the patience of someone who loved a difficult craft. They also prepared for the possibility that transparency would not be enough. There were actors in the company who smelled weakness and, like predators, sought to make it their advantage. A file leaked to a reporter, a routine memo about strategy that a journalist chose to place in the narrative of culpability. It arrived on a rainy Friday, and for a moment the room contracted into a single long intake of breath. Maxwell wanted, in that instant, to pull the covers over the world. Evelyn, who had once been practiced at letting storms pass because that was safer, steadied herself and drew a plan on the whiteboard. There would be a public conversation, yes, but it would go beyond damage control. They would convene town halls. They would invite critics. They would institute a permanent ombudsman with an independent remit. "You're proposing to expose the machinery to scrutiny?" said an old ally of Maxwell's, incredulous and approving at once. "Only the parts that are ours to show," Evelyn answered. "We don't need theater. We need structures that prevent harm, and we need to listen. We make the rules open so that they can be improved." The choice to hold openness as a principle was not without cost. Shareholders asked about short-term returns. Competitors smelled disarray and sharpened their edges. Some employees were unsettled by the idea of public forums that could be messy and painful. Maxwell found that the hardest conversations were those with people who had once trusted him and now had wounds that did not fit his old skills of management. A woman who had been on a team he had once led asked direct, undeniable questions about the culture that had allowed certain things to happen. He listened, then apologized, not for the sake of optics, but because the apology unclenched something inside him. At night, when the city had gone quiet and their apartment held only the sounds of a kettle cooling, they would lie facing each other and map out the days ahead. "We cannot fix everything," Maxwell said once, fingers finding hers. Evelyn's reply was a small, considered sound. "We can change what we steward. We can choose how to respond. We can make structures that make it harder for us to harm people without knowing it." The machine of the company churned, and with it the needs of strategy and the blunt instruments of governance. Maxwell convened a listening session in an auditorium that smelled faintly of dust and optimism. Evelyn sat on the edge of the stage. The audience was a mosaic of faces: junior staff, middle managers, a few long-tenured executives, and, tucked at the back, someone from an independent advocacy group. Maxwell began simply. He thanked people. He declined to grandstand. He admitted that some measures taken in the past had been more about image than about real repair. He invited people to speak. The stories that came were not always the ones the columnists wanted. There were accounts of small kindnesses that had been overlooked, managers who had stayed late to help someone on a deadline, colleagues who had whispered support in corridors. There were also accounts of moments where authority was exercised in ways that left edges raw. People wanted to be seen, and they wanted the company to be more than a sum of its market moves. Evelyn listened as if she were holding a fragile thing, which, in a way, she was. When she stood to speak, she did not frame the moment as an exercise in public relations. She framed it as a covenant. "We will change how we measure success," she said, and then named metrics that had nothing to do with profit: retention of people who felt heard, action on anonymous complaints, timeliness in resolving disputes. Her language was administrative and ardent at once. It was the language of someone who knew both systems and tenderness. After the session, they walked home in the soft air of a city forgiving itself. Maxwell did not have a polished victory. He had instead a ledger of work to be done and the palpable sense that transparency made things possible rather than certain. He squeezed Evelyn's hand and, without the need for theatrality, thanked her. That gratidão was not theatrally either. It was the simple recognition of the way their lives had intertwined. A patient correction here, a boundary there. The collective labor of two people refusing the easy seduction of solitude. They had written vows that served as scaffolding on days when the world wanted to shake them loose. Those vows did not perform miracles. They created a practice. The tests would not stop. Power, once weathered and rearranged, still attracted storms. There would be a moment, Maxwell felt it like a pressure in his chest, where the company would have to defend not merely its balance sheet, but the experiment Evelyn had proposed. Whether a large institution could accept public scrutiny without breaking itself on the rocks of fear and retaliation. The next weeks promised hearings and op-eds and the slow, exacting work of policy. He thought of the stairwell where they had first really seen each other, and of the sea where he had proposed. Those sights felt like talismans, small places where courage had been practiced and where, perhaps, it could be summoned again. They prepared, not for triumph, but for the possibility of remaining honest in public. The city outside their window continued its indifferent arc, glass facades catching light, the river reflecting a sky that did not contain them, but together they found ways to be present beneath it. Evelyn arranged the papers on the kitchen table. Maxwell read them over with the same care he had once reserved for quarterly reports. They were partners in a governance that was, finally, personal as much as professional, a promise to do the harder thing when the easier thing would be to hide. As spring edged toward summer, the date for a public hearing was set. They slept less and talked more. On the morning they were to stand before an audience larger and more various than any they'd addressed before, Maxwell stood at the window for a long time and watched the light on the river. Evelyn found him there and did not interrupt. She touched his back, a small pressure, a reminder of the vows they had spoken and renewed 1,000 times. "We'll tell the truth," he said finally, not to her, but to the day. "We'll tell it plainly." "Then we don't rehearse salvation," she answered. "We prepare to listen and to answer." They walked out together, keys in hand, and left the apartment that had come to mean less as a refuge from the world and more as a place where the work of love and responsibility was practiced in small gestures, emptying the dishwasher, making tea, listening when one of them needed to say the painful thing. The city closed behind them as they descended the stairwell, the same stairwell that once held the memory of a laugh that had started everything, and into which their lives had folded many ordinary and fierce commitments. Their next audience waited. They had no illusions about the outcome.
What eles carregavam era uma postura compartilhada. Responsabilidade como prática, não uma performance. As portas abriram e o cômodo dentro estava já preenchendo. Eles passaram juntos.